The smell of venison stew hit Caleb Morrison's nostrils before he even opened the cabin door, and his hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife at his belt, because no one should be in his home deep in these Colorado mountains in the summer of 1876. He had been gone for 3 weeks, trapping further north near the high peaks, and the isolation of his cabin was precisely why he had built it here, miles from the nearest settlement of Willow Creek. The wooden structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, and in all the years he had lived here, not a single soul had disturbed his solitude. Caleb pushed the door open slowly, his massive frame filling the doorway as his dark eyes scanned the interior. There, standing at his iron stove with her back to him, was a woman in a faded blue dress, her auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun, stirring something in his cast iron pot. She turned at the sound of the door, and instead of screaming or running, she simply looked at him with tired green eyes that held more exhaustion than fear. "You must be Caleb Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the way her fingers tightened on the wooden spoon. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I had nowhere else to go." Caleb stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his muscled arms crossing over his broad chest as he studied her. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders wide from years of chopping wood and hauling game, his long dark hair tied back with a leather cord. His beard was thick, but trimmed, and his sun-darkened skin spoke of countless days in the mountain wilderness. "That does not explain why you are in my home, cooking my food." The woman set the spoon down and turned to face him fully, her chin lifting slightly. "My name is Eleanor Walsh. I was traveling with a wagon train heading to California, but 3 weeks ago, we were attacked by bandits near the foothills. They took everything, killed the wagon master and several families. I managed to escape into the forest, and I have been wandering ever since. I found your cabin 5 days ago, and I was near death from hunger and exposure. I did not think you would mind if I took shelter, considering the alternative was dying in the woods." Caleb's expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. He moved toward the table, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and pulled out a chair. "Sit down and tell me everything. From the beginning." Eleanor hesitated, then moved to the table and sat across from him. Up close, Caleb could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on her frame, the scratches on her hands and forearms from pushing through brush. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 23 or 24, and there was a quiet strength in the set of her jaw despite her obvious exhaustion. "We left Independence, Missouri, in early April," Eleanor began, her hands folded on the table. "There were 12 wagons, 43 people in total. I was traveling with my aunt and uncle, the Hendersons. They owned a dry goods store in Missouri, but my uncle had dreams of starting fresh in California. I had been living with them since my parents died of fever 2 years ago." She paused, her eyes distant. "We made good time at first. The weather was favorable, and we had an experienced wagon master named Jacob Reed. But as we got into Colorado territory, things started going wrong. We lost a wagon crossing a river, and then one of the families turned back after their youngest child got sick." Caleb listened without interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He had seen enough of life on the frontier to know that tragedy was never far away, especially for those foolish enough to think they could cross the wilderness unprepared. "We camped in a valley about 2 days' ride from here," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping lower. "It was evening, and most people were preparing supper. The bandits came out of nowhere, at least a dozen of them. They had rifles and moved like they had done this before. Jacob tried to organize a defense, but they shot him first. Then they started shooting anyone who resisted. Her hands trembled slightly, and she pressed them flat against the table. My uncle grabbed a shotgun and told my aunt and me to run. I heard the shots behind us, but my aunt kept pushing me forward. We ran into the forest, but she could not keep up. She told me to keep going to find help. I did not want to leave her, but she insisted. Eleanor's voice cracked. I heard more shots after that. I just kept running. The silence that followed was heavy. Caleb stood and moved to the stove, ladling some of the stew into 2 bowls. He set one in front of Eleanor and sat down with his own. "Eat," he said simply. "You can finish the story after." Eleanor picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a bite. The warmth and sustenance seemed to steady her, and she ate several more spoonfuls before continuing. I wandered for days. I had no supplies, no weapon, nothing but the clothes on my back. I survived on berries and water from streams, but I was getting weaker. Then I saw the smoke from your chimney and found this cabin. The door was unlocked, and I let myself in. I have been here for 5 days, eating sparingly from your stores and trying to regain my strength. I fully intended to leave once I was able, but I wanted to wait and thank you in person if you returned. She met his eyes. I know this is your home, and I had no right to enter without permission. I can leave now if you wish. Caleb took a long drink from his tin cup, studying her over the rim. Where would you go? You said yourself you have nowhere else. Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly. I suppose I would try to make it to Willow Creek. Perhaps someone there could help me get word to authorities about the attack, or find other survivors. Willow Creek is 20 miles from here through rough terrain, Caleb said flatly. You would not make it 3 miles in your condition. He set his cup down. You can stay until you are strong enough to travel safely. I will take you to town myself when the time comes. Relief flooded Eleanor's face, but she quickly composed herself. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I will not be a burden, I promise. I can cook and clean, and I noticed your shirts need mending. I can earn my keep, Caleb nodded once. We will see. For now, you need rest more than anything. He gestured to the small bedroom off the main room. You have been sleeping in there, I assume. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. Yes, I am sorry. I can sleep by the fire if you prefer. No need. I will take the floor out here. The bed is not built for someone my size anyway. It was true. Caleb usually slept in the bed with his legs hanging off the end, his broad frame taking up the entire mattress. They finished eating in silence, and afterward, Eleanor insisted on cleaning up despite Caleb's protests. He watched her move around his kitchen with efficient movements, noticing how she had organized things in his absence, how the cabin was cleaner than he had left it. When she finally retreated to the bedroom, Caleb unrolled his bedding by the fireplace and lay down, his mind churning with thoughts. He had lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, ever since he had left his family's farm in Kentucky after the war ended. The war between the states had taken his 2 younger brothers and left him with scars both visible and invisible. He had come west seeking solitude, wanting nothing more than to live by his own rules, beholden to no one. The isolation had suited him, or so he had told himself. But now, with a stranger sleeping in his bed and the lingering smell of home-cooked food in the air, something felt different. The next morning, Caleb woke before dawn as was his habit. He found Eleanor already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. She looked slightly better after a full night's rest, though still far too thin. You did not need to wake so early, he said, moving to the water basin to wash his face. I am accustomed to rising early, Eleanor replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups. My aunt ran a very orderly household. She handed him a cup and their fingers brushed briefly. Caleb felt an unexpected jolt at the contact and pulled away quickly. He drank his coffee standing, then gathered his rifle and pack. "I need to check my trap lines. I will be back by afternoon. Do not leave the cabin." Eleanor frowned. "Is it not safe? There are bears, mountain lions, and apparently bandits roaming these parts. Stay inside." His tone left no room for argument. After Caleb left, Eleanor spent the morning continuing her self-appointed tasks. She found his spare shirts and pants in a trunk and set about mending the tears and worn spots. The work was soothing, familiar, and it kept her hands busy while her mind wandered. She thought about her aunt and uncle, hoping against hope that they had somehow survived, though in her heart she knew the truth. She thought about the other families on the wagon train, the children she had played with, the women she had shared recipes and stories with around the campfires. All gone in one terrible night of violence, but she also found herself thinking about Caleb Morrison. He was unlike any man she had ever met. The men in Missouri had been farmers and shopkeepers, civilized and predictable. Caleb was something else entirely, a force of nature as untamed as the mountains he called home. His physical presence was overwhelming, all muscle and strength, but there was something in his eyes that suggested depths she had not yet glimpsed. He had shown her unexpected kindness, though his manner was gruff. She wondered what had driven him to this isolated existence. Caleb returned in the early afternoon with 3 rabbits and a string of trout. He found Eleanor hanging the mended clothes on a line she had strung near the fire. "You have been busy," he observed, setting his catch on the work table. "I told you I would earn my keep," Eleanor said, moving to examine the game. "I can prepare these for supper if you like." Caleb nodded and stepped back, watching as she efficiently skinned and cleaned the rabbits. Her movements were practiced, and he raised an eyebrow. "You have done this before." "My uncle's store sometimes traded in game. I learned young." Eleanor glanced at him. "You seem surprised. Most women I have met from back east faint at the sight of blood." Eleanor's lips quirked in a small smile. "I am not most women, Mr. Morrison. I am beginning to see that, and you can call me Caleb. Then you must call me Eleanor." They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Caleb would rise early and tend to his work, checking traps, hunting, chopping wood, and maintaining the cabin. Eleanor took over the cooking and cleaning, and she began tending a small vegetable garden behind the cabin that had been badly neglected. She found herself enjoying the physical work, the simplicity of life in the mountains. There was something peaceful about it, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and slowly, cautiously, they began to share pieces of their pasts. Caleb told her about growing up in Kentucky, about his brothers Samuel and Thomas, who had died at Gettysburg and Shiloh. He spoke of his parents, who had died of heartbreak within a year of losing their youngest sons, and how he had been unable to stay on the farm surrounded by ghosts and memories. Eleanor shared her own losses, the fever that had taken her parents when she was 21, leaving her dependent on her aunt and uncle's charity. She spoke of the dreams she had harbored of California, of perhaps starting a school or finding work as a seamstress. "I wanted to be independent," she said quietly one evening. "I was grateful to my aunt and uncle, but I always felt like a burden. I thought California might offer a fresh start." Caleb looked at her across the firelight, seeing the determination in her face despite everything she had lost. "You are strong," he said simply. "Stronger than you know." Eleanor met his gaze, and something passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both been forged by loss and hardship. As the days turned into weeks, the dynamic between them shifted in subtle ways. Caleb found himself hurrying back from his trap lines, eager to return to the cabin, where Eleanor would be waiting with a warm meal and a ready smile. He caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the graceful way she moved, the sound of her humming as she kneaded bread, the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her hair. Eleanor, for her part, found her eyes drawn to Caleb more and more frequently. She noticed the way his muscles flexed as he split wood, the careful gentleness with which he handled injured animals he occasionally brought back to treat and release. She saw the intelligence in his dark eyes, the dry humor that emerged once he grew comfortable with her presence. And she felt safer than she had in months, protected by this powerful, quiet man who asked nothing of her but her company. One evening in late August, a storm rolled in from the peaks, bringing heavy rain and crashing thunder. Eleanor had always been nervous during storms, and she sat by the fire trying to hide her anxiety as wind howled around the cabin. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the walls, she flinched visibly. Caleb, who had been cleaning his rifle, set it aside and moved to sit beside her. "The cabin has weathered worse storms," he said quietly. "We are safe here." "I know," Eleanor said, trying to smile. "I am being foolish." "Fear is not foolish." Caleb hesitated, then did something that surprised them both. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. "You have survived things that would break most people. A little storm is nothing." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything. I do not know what I would have done if I had not found your cabin. You would have survived somehow. You are a survivor, Eleanor Walsh." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Caleb's thumb moved slowly across the back of her hand, a gentle caress that made Eleanor's breath catch. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both acutely aware of the shift happening between them. Then Caleb pulled his hand away and stood abruptly. "You should get some rest." "Morning comes early." Eleanor nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Good night, Caleb." After she had gone to bed, Caleb sat by the fire long into the night, his mind in turmoil. He had not allowed himself to feel anything for a woman in years, had convinced himself that solitude was what he wanted. But Eleanor had crashed into his life and turned everything upside down. He cared for her, more than he wanted to admit, and the realization terrified him. The next morning brought clear skies and cooler temperatures. Caleb announced that he needed to make a trip to Willow Creek for supplies. "You are strong enough to travel now," he said, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. "We can go together and you can stay in town. The widow who runs the boarding house will take you in, I am sure." Eleanor felt as though he had dumped cold water over her head. "Oh, yes, of course. I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It is not that," Caleb said roughly, then stopped himself. "It would be better for you. More opportunities in town." They prepared for the journey in strained silence, both miserable but neither willing to speak the truth. Caleb saddled his large bay horse, a sturdy gelding named Red, and helped Eleanor mount behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of his body, and fought back tears. She did not want to leave. Somewhere over the past weeks, this cabin in the wilderness had become home, and the silent man riding in front of her had become infinitely precious. The ride to Willow Creek took most of the day, following narrow trails through dense forest and across mountain streams. They stopped once to rest the horse and eat the lunch Eleanor had packed. The awkwardness between them had only grown, and they barely spoke beyond necessity. Willow Creek was a small settlement of perhaps 300 people, with a main street lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and the boarding house Caleb had mentioned. People stared as they rode in, clearly curious about the woman riding with the hermit from the mountains. Caleb stopped in front of the boarding house and helped Eleanor dismount. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Caleb Morrison, as I live and breathe. I have not seen you in town for months. Who is this?" "Mrs. Brennan, this is Eleanor Walsh. She is in need of lodging." Caleb's voice was tight, formal. Mrs. Brennan's sharp eyes took in Eleanor's worn dress and weary face, and her expression softened. "Come inside, dear. You look like you could use a hot meal and a proper bed." Eleanor turned to Caleb, her heart in her throat. "Thank you for everything, Caleb. I will never forget your kindness." Caleb nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." He turned and strode toward the general store without looking back. Eleanor watched him go, feeling as though her heart was being torn from her chest. Mrs. Brennan gently took her arm and led her inside, clucking sympathetically. "There now, let us get you settled. Whatever troubles you have had, they will look better after some rest." But rest did not help. Eleanor spent 3 miserable days at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Brennan with chores to earn her keep and trying to figure out what to do next. The older woman was kind, introducing her to people in town and suggesting she might find work at the general store or perhaps take in sewing. But nothing felt right. Eleanor's thoughts constantly returned to the cabin in the mountains, to the quiet man who had shown her such unexpected tenderness. Caleb, meanwhile, had returned to his cabin and thrown himself into work with almost manic intensity. He hunted from dawn to dusk, chopped enough wood to last 2 winters, and repaired parts of the cabin that did not need repairing. But everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of Eleanor. The mended clothes hanging in the wardrobe, the organized kitchen, the thriving garden, the bed that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. He told himself he had done the right thing. Eleanor deserved better than a life of isolation with a broken, scarred man. She deserved civilization, society, opportunities. But the logic did nothing to ease the ache in his chest or the emptiness that filled the cabin. On the 4th day, Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. He grabbed his rifle and moved around the side of the building, then stopped in shock. Eleanor sat astride a rented mare, wearing the same blue dress but with a determined set to her jaw. "What are you doing here?" Caleb demanded, lowering the rifle. Eleanor dismounted and faced him squarely. "I came to tell you that you are a fool, Caleb Morrison." He blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me, you heard me. A fool." Eleanor stepped closer, her green eyes flashing. "You dragged me to town because you thought it was best for me, but you never once asked what I wanted. You decided on your own that I would be better off there, that I needed civilization and society. Well, I have had 4 days of civilization, and I hated every minute of it." Caleb stared at her, his heart beginning to pound. "Eleanor." "I do not want to live in town," Eleanor continued, her voice shaking but fierce. "I do not want to work in a general store or take in sewing or make polite conversation with people who look at me with pity. I want to be here in these mountains, in that cabin, with you." She took a deep breath. "I know I am being forward, and perhaps you do not feel the same way, but I had to tell you the truth. These past weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything. I feel at home here. I feel at home with you." Caleb closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, his large hands cradling her face as he kissed her with all the pent-up longing and emotion he had been holding back. Eleanor melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I am the fool," he said hoarsely. "I sent you away because I thought you deserved better than what I could offer. But the truth is, I have been miserable without you. The cabin felt empty. My life felt empty. I love you, Eleanor Walsh. I think I have loved you since the day I came home and found you cooking in my kitchen." Eleanor laughed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love you too. I did not realize it until you were taking me away, and then it was like a light going on in my head. I do not need anything but you." Caleb kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the feel of her in his arms. When they finally pulled apart, he kept one arm firmly around her waist, as if afraid she might disappear. "Are you certain? Life here is hard. The winters are brutal and we are miles from anyone. You would be giving up so much." "I would be giving up nothing that matters," Eleanor said firmly. "I would be gaining everything I want. A home, a purpose. You," she smiled up at him. "Besides, someone needs to keep your shirts mended and make sure you eat properly." Caleb laughed, a deep rumbling sound that Eleanor had rarely heard. "When you put it that way, I suppose I have no choice but to keep you." "No choice at all," Eleanor agreed, then turned more serious. "But Caleb, I need to know that you are not doing this out of obligation or pity. I need to know that you truly want me here." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes intense. "I have never wanted anything more in my life. You brought light back into my world, Eleanor. You made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond mere survival. I was not living before you came, I was just existing. I do not want to go back to that emptiness." "Then I am staying," Eleanor said simply, "if you will have me." "I will have you," Caleb said, pulling her close again, "for as long as you will stay, forever if you are willing." They stood there in the mountain sunshine, holding each other, both feeling as though they had finally found where they belonged. Eventually, Caleb pulled back and looked toward the cabin. "We should probably discuss practicalities. Like the fact that there is only one bed and I have been sleeping on the floor." Eleanor blushed, but met his eyes steadily. "I suppose we should get married then." "I suppose we should," Caleb agreed, his lips quirking. "Unless you object to marrying a hermit mountain man." "I cannot think of anything I would like better," Eleanor said honestly. They rode back to Willow Creek the next day, Eleanor once again seated behind Caleb on Red, but this time her arms around his waist felt like a promise rather than a goodbye. They went directly to the church, where Reverend Thomas was more than happy to perform a simple ceremony with Mrs. Brennan and the blacksmith standing as witnesses. Mrs. Brennan cried happy tears and insisted on hosting a small celebration at the boarding house afterward, inviting half the town. Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the kindness of these frontier strangers who welcomed her into their community without question. Several women promised to visit when the weather allowed, and the general store owner offered them credit for any supplies they might need over the winter. "Folks here look out for each other," Mrs. Brennan explained to Eleanor as she pressed a package of food into her hands. "It does not matter that you are new. You are one of us now." As Caleb and Eleanor rode back up the mountain trails toward home, now husband and wife, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She had lost everything, wandered alone and terrified through the wilderness, and stumbled half dead into a stranger's cabin. And somehow, from that tragedy and desperation, she had found love and a new beginning. The cabin looked different to her now, not as a temporary shelter but as her home. Their home. Caleb helped her dismount and then swept her up in his arms, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner. Eleanor laughed in surprise and delight, her arms around his neck. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "It feels good to be home," Eleanor replied softly. He set her down gently, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, both a little uncertain now that they were alone as husband and wife. Then Eleanor reached up and began removing the pins from her hair, letting the auburn waves fall around her shoulders. Caleb's breath caught, and he reached out to run his fingers through the silky strands. "You are beautiful," he said quietly. "I've thought so since the first day." Eleanor smiled and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly. "You are not so bad yourself, mountain man." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, two lonely souls finding comfort and connection in each other's arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Caleb's large frame taking up most of the space, but neither of them minding. Eleanor traced the scars on his chest and arms, marks from the war and from years of hard living, and Caleb stroked her hair, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "Tell me about the stew," Caleb said suddenly, and Eleanor lifted her head to look at him in confusion. "What stew?" "The first day I came home and found you here. You were making venison stew. It smelled incredible, and I realized later that it tasted even better. My own cooking is barely edible, but what you made was remarkable. How did you do it?" Eleanor laughed softly. "There was not much to work with, just the dried venison and some vegetables from the garden. But I found wild herbs growing near the stream, rosemary and thyme. I added those, along with some of the dried mushrooms you had hanging in the cabin. My mother taught me that the secret to good cooking is patience and the right seasonings." Caleb smiled and kissed the top of her head. "That stew changed everything, you know. If it had tasted terrible, I might have sent you to town right away. But it was so good, I found myself wanting you to stay, wanting more meals like that, wanting you. So I won you over with food," Eleanor teased. "You won me over with everything," Caleb said seriously. "The food was just the beginning. Your strength, your courage, your kindness, the way you fit into this life so naturally. I did not stand a chance." They talked long into the night, making plans for the future, sharing dreams and fears. Eleanor admitted her worry about the coming winter, having heard stories of how brutal mountain winters could be. Caleb assured her they would be well prepared, and he would teach her everything she needed to know about surviving in the wilderness. The weeks that followed were blissfully happy. They fell into comfortable routines, working together to prepare for winter. Caleb taught Eleanor how to shoot a rifle, how to read the weather signs, how to identify animal tracks. Eleanor continued to improve the cabin, adding small touches that made it feel more like a real home. Curtains for the windows made from an old sheet she had found, wildflowers in a jar on the table, her few belongings mixed in with his. They also made frequent trips to Willow Creek, where Eleanor began to form friendships with the other women in town. She particularly bonded with Sarah Hendricks, the doctor's wife, who was near her age and had also come west as a bride. Sarah was fascinated by Eleanor's story and admired her bravery in choosing such an unconventional life. "Most women would have jumped at the chance to stay in town," Sarah said during one visit as they shelled peas on Mrs. Brennan's porch. "But you went back to the mountains. That takes real courage, or perhaps real foolishness," Eleanor said with a smile. "But I could not imagine my life any other way now. I love it up there. I love the quiet, the beauty, the simplicity, and I love my husband." "That much is obvious," Sarah said, her eyes twinkling. "The way Caleb looks at you, like you hung the moon. I do not think I have ever seen him smile before you came along." One day in early October, Caleb announced they should make a trip to check some distant trap lines and perhaps hunt elk while they were out. He suggested Eleanor come with him, wanting to share more of his world with her. They packed supplies for 3 days and set out on horseback, Eleanor riding the mare they had purchased for her, a gentle chestnut named Daisy. The trip took them high into the peaks, through terrain so beautiful it took Eleanor's breath away. They camped under the stars, wrapped in blankets, and Caleb pointed out constellations, and told her stories his grandfather had told him about the mountains, and the people who had lived here long before settlers arrived. Eleanor listened, enthralled, feeling like she was seeing the world through new eyes. On the third day, as they were heading back toward home, they came across a horrifying sight: the remains of a wagon train scattered across a meadow. Eleanor recognized it immediately, her heart lurching. "Caleb, this is it. This is my wagon train." They dismounted and walked through the scene slowly, Eleanor's eyes filling with tears at the destruction. The wagons had been burned, their contents scattered and looted. But as they searched, they found something unexpected: graves. Someone had buried the dead, at least a dozen marked graves with crude wooden crosses. "Someone came after the attack," Caleb said, examining the site. "Probably people from one of the settlements. They gave the victims a proper burial." Eleanor knelt by one grave marked Henderson, her hands shaking. "My aunt and uncle." She had known they were gone, but seeing the proof made it real in a way it had not been before. Tears streamed down her face as she said a prayer over their resting place. Caleb gave her time, standing guard silently. Then he helped her gather stones to place on the graves, marking them more permanently. "I am sorry you had to see this," he said quietly, "but perhaps there is some comfort in knowing they were laid to rest with dignity." Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. "I needed to see it. I needed to say goodbye properly." She looked around the meadow, remembering the laughter and life that had once filled this space. They were good people. They deserved better. "Yes, they did," Caleb agreed. He hesitated, then added, "If you want, we can report what we found to the territorial marshal in Willow Creek. Maybe they can track down the bandits who did this." Eleanor considered it, then shook her head. "I do not think it would do any good. The bandits are probably long gone, and nothing will bring these people back. I just want to move forward now, to live the life they would have wanted for me." They rode home in thoughtful silence, both processing what they had seen. That night, Caleb held Eleanor close as she cried out her grief, finally allowing herself to truly mourn all that she had lost. And when her tears were spent, she felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that made the forest look magical. Eleanor stood on the porch, wrapped in a warm shawl, watching the flakes fall with delight. Caleb came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Beautiful, is it not?" he murmured against her hair. "Breathtaking," Eleanor agreed. "I have never seen anything like this. Wait until the real winter comes. This is just a preview." The real winter arrived in late November, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold, but true to Caleb's word, they were well prepared. The cabin was well insulated, they had plenty of food stored, and the woodpile was stacked high. Eleanor discovered she did not mind being snowbound, finding it cozy and romantic to be trapped in their small cabin with nothing but each other for company. They spent the long winter evenings reading by firelight, Caleb working through Eleanor's small collection of books with surprising enthusiasm. Eleanor taught him some of the songs her mother had taught her, and they would sing together while she cooked. They also talked endlessly, sharing every detail of their lives, their thoughts and opinions, their hopes for the future. It was during one of these conversations in December that Eleanor realized her monthly courses were late. She had been feeling vaguely unwell in the mornings, and her breasts were tender. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She was almost certainly pregnant. She decided to wait to tell Caleb until she was absolutely certain. When another week passed with no change and the morning sickness became more pronounced, she knew. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor took Caleb's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is something I need to tell you," she said softly. Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes questioning. "What is it?" "I am with child. Our baby will come in the summer, I think. For a long moment, Caleb simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious features. A baby, truly. Eleanor nodded, tears of happiness in her eyes. Truly. Caleb let out a whoop of joy that startled them both, then pulled Eleanor into his arms and spun her around. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "I never thought I would have this, a family of my own." "Well, you are getting one," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Caleb said, cupping her face in his hands. "You have given me everything, Eleanor, a home, love, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve such blessings, but I will spend the rest of my life being grateful." He became impossibly more protective after that, insisting Eleanor rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, hovering anxiously whenever she showed the slightest sign of discomfort. Eleanor found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not ill," she protested when he tried to stop her from kneading bread one morning. "Women have been doing this for thousands of years while working much harder than I am." "I know," Caleb said, looking sheepish. "But you are my wife, carrying my child. Let me fuss over you a little." Eleanor softened and kissed his cheek. "A little fussing I can handle, but you must let me stay active. It is good for me and the baby." They compromised, with Eleanor continuing her normal activities, but allowing Caleb to take over the heavier chores. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher, they settled into a peaceful domesticity that both found deeply satisfying. Christmas came, and Eleanor insisted on making it special despite their isolation. She baked special breads and cookies, using their precious supply of sugar and spices. She made Caleb a new shirt from fabric she had purchased during their last trip to town, embroidering his initials on the pocket. Caleb, in turn, surprised her with a beautifully carved cradle he had been working on in secret in the shed, made from smooth pine and decorated with careful designs. Eleanor cried when she saw it, running her hands over the smooth wood. "It is perfect. Our baby will love it." "I hope so," Caleb said gruffly, pleased by her reaction. "I have been working on it for weeks." They spent Christmas Day together, just the two of them, and both agreed it was the best Christmas either had ever had. They attended a simple church service, exchanged their gifts, ate a special meal Eleanor had prepared, and spent the evening talking about the baby and imagining what their life would be like as parents. "You hope for a boy or a girl?" Eleanor asked, curled against Caleb's side. "I do not care as long as you and the baby are healthy," Caleb said honestly. Then he grinned. "Though a boy would be practical, someone to help with the work when he is older. And what if we have a girl? Girls can work too, you know." "That is true. You certainly prove that every day." Caleb stroked her hair. "A girl would be welcome too, especially if she looks like her mother." Eleanor smiled and kissed him. "We will love whatever we get." The winter seemed endless, but eventually signs of spring began to appear. The snow started to melt in March, revealing the muddy earth beneath. By April, the meadow around the cabin was turning green, and wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Eleanor's belly had grown round and prominent, and she moved with the careful waddle of late pregnancy. Caleb insisted they make a trip to Willow Creek in early May so that Eleanor could be near Dr. Hendricks when her time came. Eleanor protested, wanting to have the baby in their cabin, but Caleb was adamant. "I will not risk you or the baby," he said firmly. "What if something goes wrong and we are 2 hours from help?" "No, we are staying in town until after the birth." Eleanor, recognizing the fear beneath his stubbornness, agreed. They settled into Mrs. Brennan's boarding house, where the kind woman fussed over Eleanor and made sure she was comfortable. Sarah Hendricks visited daily, bringing supplies and advice, becoming a good friend during those waiting weeks. The baby decided to arrive on a warm evening in late May. Eleanor's labor started just after supper, and Dr. Hendricks was summoned immediately. Caleb paced outside the room like a caged animal, his face pale with worry. Mrs. Brennan and Sarah stayed with Eleanor, coaching her through the contractions and offering comfort. It was a long night, but as dawn broke, the sound of a baby's cry filled the boarding house. Caleb burst through the door, his eyes wild with worry and hope. Eleanor lay exhausted but smiling in the bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Caleb approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the tiny red face peering out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was waving one tiny fist in the air. Something shifted in Caleb's chest, a fierce wave of love and protectiveness so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "He is perfect," Caleb whispered, touching one finger to the baby's soft cheek. "You are perfect. Thank you, Eleanor." Eleanor smiled tiredly. "I was thinking we could name him Thomas after your brother, if that is all right with you." Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "I would like that very much." He bent and kissed Eleanor gently. "I love you, both of you, more than I can say." They stayed in Willow Creek for 2 weeks while Eleanor recovered her strength, then made the journey back to the cabin with baby Thomas bundled carefully in his mother's arms. The cabin felt different now, filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and gurgles. Caleb had never known he could feel such contentment, coming home to find Eleanor nursing the baby in the rocking chair he had made, humming softly. Life settled into new rhythms. Eleanor managed the household and cared for Thomas with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Caleb continued his work, but found himself hurrying back more than ever, eager to spend time with his wife and son. He would sit for hours just watching Thomas sleep, marveling at the tiny miracle they had created. When Thomas was 3 months old, Eleanor broached a subject that had been on her mind. "I was thinking," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "that we should plant apple trees in the meadow, 4 or 5 of them. They would take years to bear fruit, but imagine having fresh apples every fall." Caleb considered this. "That would be good. We could plant them this fall when the weather cools, maybe some cherry trees too. And I would like to expand the garden next spring. We have so much land we could grow much more than we do now, maybe even trade some of our produce in town." Caleb smiled at her enthusiasm. "You are planning our future." "Our family's future," Eleanor corrected. "This is Thomas's home too. I want it to be prosperous and beautiful for him." They planted the trees that fall, and over the following years, they continued to improve their homestead. They built a larger barn for the animals they acquired, added a root cellar for storage, and expanded the cabin to include a second bedroom for Thomas and any future children. Those future children came in due time. 2 years after Thomas was born, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes. 3 years after that came another son, Samuel, named for Caleb's other brother. Each child was welcomed with joy and love, and the cabin that had once been so silent filled with laughter and noise. Caleb proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving with his children. He taught them about the mountains and forests, how to track animals and identify plants, how to fish and hunt. Eleanor taught them their letters and numbers, reading to them from her precious few books and making up stories about brave pioneers and magical forests. The family made regular trips to Willow Creek, where Thomas, Rose, and Samuel played with the other children while Eleanor caught up with her friends and Caleb conducted business. They became well-known and well-liked in the community, the mountain family who lived in harmony with the wilderness. As the years passed, Caleb and Eleanor's love only deepened. They still stole moments alone when they could, walking through the forest hand in hand or sitting together on the porch after the children were asleep. They remained each other's best friend and confidant, partners in every sense of the word. One evening when Thomas was 10, Rose was 8, and Samuel was 5, the family sat together around the dinner table. Thomas was telling an elaborate story about a bear he claimed to have seen near the stream. Rose was giggling, and Samuel was making a mess of his dinner. Eleanor looked around the table at her family and felt her heart swell with happiness. Later, after the children were tucked into bed, she and Caleb sat by the fire. "Do you ever think about that day you came home and found me in your kitchen?" Eleanor asked softly. Caleb pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "All the time. I think about how close I came to sending you away immediately, how different my life would be if I had." "Mine too," Eleanor said. "I had lost everything, but finding this place, finding you, gave me a whole new life, a better life than I ever imagined." "That stew you were making," Caleb said with a smile. "I still think about it sometimes. The smell of it when I opened the door, how it seemed to fill the whole cabin with warmth. It was just food, but somehow it represented everything I did not know I was missing. Comfort, care, home." "I was so frightened when you walked in," Eleanor admitted. "You were so large and intimidating, all muscles and silence. But then you let me stay, and I started to see the man beneath the rough exterior. The kind, lonely man who just needed someone to care for him." "We needed each other," Caleb said simply. "Two broken people who found each other at exactly the right time." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the mountain night and the quiet breathing of their children in the next room. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere an owl hooted. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and two people who had once been lost had found exactly where they belonged. Years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. Winters remained harsh, but the family always weathered them together. There were illnesses and injuries, moments of fear and worry, but there was also so much love and laughter. The apple trees Eleanor had planted grew tall and strong, bearing fruit that made the best pies in the territory. The garden flourished, providing more than enough for the family and surplus to trade in town. Thomas grew into a strong young man who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Rose was clever and creative, always reading or making up stories. Samuel was the adventurous one, always getting into mild trouble, but with such a sweet nature that no one could stay mad at him for long. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to build his own cabin on the far side of their property and make his life as a trapper and hunter like his father. Caleb helped him with the construction, working side by side with his son, and Eleanor tried not to cry as she watched her oldest prepare to start his own life. Rose, at 16, had attracted the attention of the teacher's son in Willow Creek, a serious young man named Daniel who treated her with respect and admiration. Eleanor and Caleb gave their blessing when Daniel asked to court her, knowing that their daughter would likely marry and move to town within a few years. Samuel, at 13, was still figuring out who he wanted to be, but he showed a talent for working with wood like his father, carving intricate designs, and making furniture that people in town were willing to pay good money for. One crisp autumn evening, when Eleanor was 42 and Caleb was 47, they walked together through the orchard they had planted nearly 20 years before. The trees were heavy with apples, and the air smelled of earth and ripening fruit. Their hair was now streaked with gray, and their faces bore the lines of years of mountain living, but their love had only grown stronger with time. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked, taking Eleanor's hand. Staying here, giving up the chance at an easier life in town or California. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that? Caleb shrugged, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Sometimes I worry that I was selfish, letting you stay when you could have had so much more. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. Caleb Morrison, you listened to me. You gave me everything I ever wanted, even things I did not know I wanted. A home, a family, a life filled with purpose and love. Yes, it has been hard sometimes. Yes, I have been cold in winter and exhausted from work, but I have never, not once, wished for a different life, because this is my life with you, and it is perfect. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. I love you, Eleanor, just as much as the day I realized I could not let you go. And I love you, Eleanor said, her voice muffled against his chest. My mountain man who came home to find a strange woman cooking in his kitchen. They stood there under the apple trees as the sun set, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a beautiful life together. Around them, the mountains stood eternal, witnesses to their love story. The years that followed brought the natural evolution of a family growing and changing. Thomas married a girl from a neighboring homestead, a capable young woman named Margaret, and they had their first child, making Caleb and Eleanor grandparents for the first time. The joy of holding their grandson was almost overwhelming, a continuation of the family they had built. Rose married Daniel in a lovely ceremony in the Willow Creek Church, and they settled in town where Daniel took over his father's position as teacher. She visited often with her parents, bringing her new husband to the cabin and sharing her happiness with them. Samuel, true to his artistic nature, decided to apprentice with a furniture maker in Denver for a year, but he promised to return to the mountains when his training was complete. Eleanor worried about him being so far away, but she knew he needed to follow his own path. As Caleb and Eleanor entered their 50s, they found themselves with more time together again, the cabin quieter with the children grown. But it was a comfortable quiet, filled with the ease of two people who knew each other completely. They still worked hard, but they also took time to simply enjoy the life they had built. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. From the terrified, desperate woman who had stumbled into this cabin nearly 30 years ago to the confident, happy woman she was now. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About that venison stew," Eleanor said with a smile. "The one I was making the day you came home. You said earlier that it changed everything, but I think it was more than just the stew. It was us, recognizing something in each other. Two lost souls who needed exactly what the other could provide." Caleb nodded slowly. "I think you are right. The stew was just the beginning, the first sign that maybe I did not have to be alone anymore. But it was you who truly changed everything. Your strength, your courage, your willingness to see beyond my rough exterior to the man beneath. And you saw me," Eleanor said softly. "Not as a burden or a charity case, but as a person of worth. You gave me back my dignity and my purpose." They sat in companionable silence, hands clasped together, watching as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains rose around them, constant and enduring, just as their love had proven to be. In the years that followed, they were blessed to watch their family continue to grow. More grandchildren arrived, filling family gatherings with noise and laughter. Thomas took over more of the heavy work on the homestead, insisting his parents should take things easier. Rose's children loved visiting the cabin, begging their grandfather for stories about the old days and learning to fish in the stream with their grandmother. Samuel returned from Denver with new skills and ideas, building a workshop on the property where he created beautiful furniture that was sought after throughout the territory. He eventually married a widow with 2 young children, instantly making Caleb and Eleanor step-grandparents, a role they embraced with typical love and enthusiasm. As they aged, Caleb's dark hair turned silver and his movements became slower, but his strength remained, both physical and of character. Eleanor's auburn hair faded to a soft gray, and her hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever. They faced the challenges of aging together, supporting each other through aches and pains, celebrating each birthday as a gift. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled every corner, and a long table was set up outside under the apple trees for the feast Eleanor and her daughters-in-law prepared. Thomas stood and offered a toast to his parents, his voice thick with emotion. "To my mother and father," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that a life well lived is not measured in wealth or status, but in the quality of the relationships you build. Who created a home so filled with love that all of us carry it with us wherever we go. Thank you for everything." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the toast, and Caleb pulled Eleanor close, kissing her soundly to the cheers and laughter of their family. Eleanor felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she looked around at the people they had brought into the world, the legacy of love they had created. That night, after everyone had left or settled down to sleep in various corners of the cabin and Samuel's workshop, Caleb and Eleanor walked through the moonlit orchard, as had become their habit on special occasions. The trees stood tall and full, heavy with fruit even this late in the season. "We built something good here," Caleb said, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Something that will last long after we are gone." "We did," Eleanor agreed. "And it all started with me being desperate and hungry, breaking into your cabin and making stew from whatever I could find." Caleb laughed. "The best thing that ever happened to me was coming home to find a strange woman cooking in my kitchen. I should have thanked those bandits." "Do not say that," Eleanor said, but she was smiling. "What happened to those people was terrible, but I suppose some good came from that tragedy. I found you and you found me, and together we built all of this." They stood under the apple trees, 2 people who had weathered storms and celebrated joys, who had faced hardships and created beauty, who had loved each other through everything. The mountains stood eternal around them, and the stars wheeled overhead. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. As they grew older still, into their 60s, Caleb and Eleanor settled into a peaceful rhythm. They spent their days puttering around the homestead, tending the garden, and enjoying visits from their ever-expanding family. Thomas had taken over most of the trapping and hunting, allowing Caleb to finally slow down after decades of hard work. Eleanor continued to cook, though her daughters-in-law often tried to take over, insisting she should rest. But Eleanor loved being in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had first cooked for Caleb all those years ago. She taught her granddaughters her recipes, passing down the knowledge her own mother had given her. On quiet evenings, Caleb would read aloud to Eleanor as she worked on her knitting, his deep voice filling the cabin with stories of adventure and romance. Sometimes they would simply sit together, watching the fire, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of companionship. One winter evening, when Eleanor was 65 and Caleb was 70, a heavy snow was falling outside, blanketing the world in white. They sat by the fire, wrapped in quilts Eleanor had made over the years, watching the flames dance. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said softly, about legacy, about what we leave behind when we are gone. Caleb looked at her, seeing the wisdom and grace in her lined face, the face he loved more than any other. "What about it?" "I think ours is a good one," Eleanor said. "Not just the children and grandchildren, though they are wonderful, but the example we set. We showed them that love is not just romance and passion, though we had plenty of that. We showed them that love is also work and commitment and choosing each other every single day, even when things are hard." Caleb reached over and took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "We did, and we showed them that it is never too late for a fresh start, that tragedy does not have to define you. That sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Like a strange woman cooking in your kitchen," Eleanor said with a smile. "Like a strange woman cooking in my kitchen," Caleb agreed. "The best surprise I ever had." They sat together as the snow continued to fall, two people who had lived a full and beautiful life together. They had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. They had raised children and welcomed grandchildren. They had built a home not just of wood and stone, but of love and laughter and shared dreams. The years continued to pass gently. They celebrated their 35th anniversary surrounded by family, then their 40th. Each milestone was marked with gratitude for the time they had been given together. Their bodies grew frailer, their movements slower, but their love remained as strong as ever. When Caleb was 75, he fell ill with a fever that would not break. Eleanor nursed him with the same devotion she had shown for their entire marriage, sitting by his bedside day and night. The family gathered, all of them knowing that the end was approaching. But Caleb fought his way back from the brink, determined not to leave Eleanor yet. "I am not done with you," he told her when the fever finally broke, his voice weak but firm. "I need more time." "Then take it," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "Take all the time you need. I am not ready to let you go either." He recovered slowly, and though he never quite regained his full strength, he was able to continue enjoying life with his beloved wife. They spent their days in peaceful companionship, often sitting together in the cabin or on the porch, holding hands and watching the world go by. One beautiful spring day, when wildflowers carpeted the meadow and the apple trees were in full bloom, Eleanor suggested they take a walk. Caleb agreed, and they made their way slowly through the orchard, stopping frequently to rest and admire the beauty around them. "This is where we come full circle," Eleanor said, looking around at the trees they had planted so many decades ago. "We planted these trees when Thomas was a baby, planning for a future we could barely imagine. And now here we are in that future, and it turned out even better than we dreamed." "It did," Caleb agreed. He stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor Morrison, I need you to know something. Every single day I spent with you was a gift. You took a broken, lonely man and showed him what it meant to truly live. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me everything." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "And you, Caleb Morrison, took a desperate, lost woman and gave her a reason to keep going. You showed me that tragedy does not have to be the end of the story. You gave me love and safety and a beautiful life. We gave each other everything." They stood there among the blooming apple trees, two souls who had found each other against all odds and created something truly extraordinary. Their journey had started with Eleanor cooking a simple stew in a stranger's cabin, and it had led to a lifetime of love, family, and happiness. They lived several more peaceful years together, each day a blessing. They watched more grandchildren and even great-grandchildren arrive. They celebrated holidays and birthdays. They continued to share meals and stories and quiet moments by the fire. And through it all, their love remained constant, a beacon that had guided them through decades of life together. When Eleanor was 72 and Caleb was 77, they passed away within hours of each other, peacefully in their sleep. It was as if neither could bear to exist without the other, even for a short time. They were buried together in the small cemetery in Willow Creek under a shared headstone that read simply, Caleb and Eleanor Morrison, two souls, one love, together forever. Their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them, sharing stories of the couple who had loved so deeply and lived so fully. Thomas spoke of the lessons his father had taught him about living honorably and treating others with respect. Rose remembered her mother's kindness and the way she had always made everyone feel welcome in their home. Samuel talked about the work ethic and creativity both his parents had modeled. But perhaps the most touching tribute came from Margaret, Thomas's wife, who had known Eleanor and Caleb for over 40 years. They showed all of us what marriage should be, she said, her voice breaking. Not perfect, because no one is perfect, but committed and loving and real. They chose each other every single day, and that choice created this beautiful family we are all part of. Their love story did not end when they died. It lives on in all of us, in the values they taught us, in the way we treat our own spouses, in the home they built that will stand for generations. That is the real legacy of Caleb and Eleanor Morrison. Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would still visit the old cabin, preserved by the family as a reminder of where they all came from. They would walk through the rooms where Caleb and Eleanor had lived and loved, and they would hear the stories of the strange woman who had been found cooking in the mountain man's kitchen, and how that chance encounter had changed everything for two lonely souls. The orchard continued to produce apples year after year, the trees that Eleanor had planted still strong and fruitful. The mountains stood eternal as they always had, witnesses to a love story that had begun in desperation and ended in grace. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines, it almost seemed as if you could hear the sound of laughter coming from the old cabin, or smell the aroma of venison stew cooking on the stove. Because some love stories are so powerful, so real, that they transcend even death itself. And the story of Caleb and Eleanor Morrison was one of those stories. It was a tale of survival and hope, of loss and redemption, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built a life that became a testament to the enduring power of love. From that first moment when Caleb opened his cabin door to find a stranger cooking in his kitchen, to the day they both passed peacefully in their sleep, their story had been one of devotion, partnership, and deep, abiding love. They had proven that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary lives, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and overcome any obstacle. Their descendants would carry their story forward, telling it to new generations, ensuring that the legacy of Caleb and Eleanor Morrison would never be forgotten. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth, that love, real and true and lasting, can change everything. It changed a mountain man who thought he wanted to be alone. It changed a desperate woman who had lost everything. And in changing them, it created something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. The cabin in the mountains stood as a monument to their love. The orchard they planted continued to bear fruit, and the family they created continued to grow and thrive. All because one summer day in 1876, a mountain man came home to find a strange woman cooking in his kitchen, and what she served changed everything. Not just the meal, though that venison stew had been surprisingly delicious, but what she brought with her. Hope, love, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. And so their story ended not with sadness but with celebration, not with regret but with gratitude, not with an ending but with a continuation in the hearts and lives of all those they had touched. It was a perfect conclusion to a love story that had begun in the most imperfect circumstances, proof that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, and that true love, once found, lasts forever.